But what is old is new again, isn't it, Digby? We're going to. It feels like Donald Trump wants to hit all three of the same articles of impeachment that Richard Nixon was faced with, and this story in Buzzfeed. We got to be a little bit careful because this stuck out for me in this BuzzFeed story, and I want to get your take on this, obviously, but it was reported by two law enforcement officers who are familiar with the investigation, I guess, that that Donald Trump specifically told Cohen to lie to Congress about Cohen's repeated, contacts over this Trump Tower building in Russia. Now, the Trump Tower building in Russia itself, it could be just as innocuous as, he wanted to build a Trump Tower in Russia. He's perfectly allowed to do that. For some reason, he didn't want that to be known. And he told his lawyer to lie to Congress about it. And his lawyer, I guess, did lie to Congress about it. And I just read this before you came on, but it's worth reading again. I mean, I think you know this, is that the third article of impeachment, Nixon, was specifically the words, "We're counseling witnesses with respect to giving false or misleading statements to lawfully authorized investigative officers and false and misleading testimony in duly instituted judicial and congressional proceedings." Check, right? I mean, if this story is true from BuzzFeed, check.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, and this isn't the first we've heard of this. It just has some new detail that we hadn't heard before. And one of the reasons why I think it's got so much credibility is that this charge turned up in the Michael Cohen, the Mueller, sentencing agreement for Michael Cohen for his lying to Congress. And so we knew that this sort of was out there, but what we didn't know before, what this adds to it, is the fact that this has been confirmed by two law enforcement representatives. One assumes this must be from the Southern District of New York, which is interesting in itself because we had assumed that this stuff was sort of centered in the Mueller investigation, but it's possible that they're both kind of looking at this Trump Tower Moscow deal for different reasons, and that's how the information is being shared among the two offices. But there's also this detail that there is some documentary evidence. Now, what that is, we don't know. I heard Leopold on TV this morning, one of the reporters,
right.
Jason Leopold, saying that they were very confident. They wouldn't say that they had seen it or not seen it, that they'd been briefed, whatever it is, but they're very confident that it exists. I guess you can think they're lying about that, but it wouldn't make much sense. And what that means is that it's either a tape, which would be extremely, you want to talk about the Watergate parallels, or, it's some kind of an order that came through on paper. Now, that's not how Trump does business. He's generally a guy who gives his orders verbally. So I'm thinking that it's some kind of a tape, and we know that Cohen was taping things.
Right.
So.
Right. We know Cohen was taping things throughout that period of time. It sounds like he was taping it almost for years on some level. Like he was aware, like I've got to protect myself. All right. It makes this testimony from William Barr that much more important. And it's interesting, there's a lot of times, and particularly I go back to when we saw Wyden and Merkley, I think it was, when they would ask specific questions about, of Clapper regarding the NSA spying. And there was a sense that they had answers, right, about certain things that they couldn't talk about. And they would ask questions that were specifically a function of that. And I think they're and here is Amy Klobuchar. And you get the sense that Amy Klobuchar 2 days ago had a sense that stuff like this was maybe out there to drop or, was just paying attention. But here is her line of questioning of the Attorney General nominee who just had his hearings 2 days ago.
In your memo, you talked about the Comey decision, and you talked about obstruction of justice, and you already went over that, which I appreciate. You wrote on page 1 that a president persuading a person to commit perjury would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Or any person who persuades another to, yeah.
Okay. You also said that a president or any person convincing a witness to change testimony would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And on page 2, you said that a president deliberately impairing the integrity or availability of evidence would be an obstruction. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so what if a president told a witness not to cooperate with an investigation or hinted at a pardon?
I'd have to know the specific. I'd have to know the specific facts.
Okay. And you wrote on page 1 that if a president knowingly destroys or alters evidence, that would be obstruction.
Yes.
Okay. So what if a president drafted a misleading statement to conceal the purpose of a meeting? Would that be obstruction?
Again, I'd have to know the specifics.
Well, you probably will soon. But so, I mean, there it is. I mean, she's basically lays out 2 or 3 things that I think, are fairly clear that Donald Trump or is suspected of doing. And if this reporting is true, but what do you make? Here's what's like. This is the first, if I'm not mistaken, this seems to be the first information we have about this investigation that has come from law enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't remember a single other piece of information. What we've gotten up to this point are different defense attorneys trying to protect their client by giving information about other people who are caught up in this investigation. I don't remember another story of significance, it seems to me, in which law enforcement officials were cited. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, like I said before, I think that this had to have come from the Southern District of New York. And I think that Leopold and Cormier, the 2 reporters for Buzzfeed, they also dropped the story about the Trump Tower Moscow deal that was going on through 2015. I suspect that that's where it's coming from, that they're more leaky, and that the Mueller investigation, I mean, we really have no idea outside of the actual court filings what that case looks like. But the Southern District of New York, maybe it could be FBI agents or some kind of, other investigators that they have on staff, something like that. It's interesting they call them law enforcement. So, I guess that could apply to prosecutors too. I don't even know. But
definitely,
that's where I suspect that it's coming from, is from there. And it like I said, it's very curious because it means that this particular part of the Russia investigation that has to do with Trump Tower Moscow, I'm assuming that much of that originated from that Cohen investigation, that's where they got this documentary evidence, that's where they discovered this. And maybe it's just something that, they had, and then they turned it over to Mueller, and they're just sort of repeating what they already knew. But I don't think that's true, because this sentencing agreement that Cohen just did with Mueller, that had to do with this perjury or, lying to Congress. So that's pretty recent. So I'm assuming that they must be working in tandem there. There's some kind of a co-equal investigation on this Moscow Trump Tower thing. And it's really looking like that is a much bigger part of this, I think, than we may have realized, that there's much more to this Trump Tower Moscow thing. I mean, I read something last night that there's someone saying that in the agreement that Trump signed, remember he said there was no signed agreement, then later it turns up the signed agreement that they actually had a deal, that in that deal was supposed to be $1 million in earnest money that the Russian developers were supposed to give to Donald Trump. And now people are wondering, did that money ever get sent? I mean, was there actually $1 million exchanged somewhere in the middle of all this? Which, and of course you're wondering whose interests are being served going either direction. I mean, we know that Donald Trump's interests were being served by Russians helping him win the election. what were the Russians getting out of this at the time, and which people were they? I mean, we know that the Russian system tends to, the government is very much involved with these developers and these oligarchs with all the money, and that this is sort of a very elite group that sort of works together. So who was involved in all that? So that part of the story, which is not something we've concentrated on until recently, for obvious reasons, we didn't really know about it. That seems to be a much bigger deal. So it's interesting that this is the first leaks we're getting out from those kinds of sources in this, because Sam, remember in all the other investigations, I mean, you go back to the 90s, these prosecutors leaked like a sieve, and they did it very, strategically. They were trying to put pressure on witnesses and doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, they played a lot of those so-called pseudo scandals in the Clinton years in the press. I mean, they
Right.
used the press as part of their strategy, and that's just not happened with Mueller before. And so it's not something that is unique. That this kind of a leak coming from law enforcement isn't unusual. What's unusual is that there haven't been leaks coming from law
Right.
enforcement. So
Right. Interesting. And